It's a great pleasure to welcome the Minister here to CSIS this morning. I want to simply say that Brazil and the United States are at a time when our national interests and the views of our two presidents coincide more closely than has been the case in many years on issues as varied as Venezuela, regional threats to security, as well as the serious global threat represented by North Korea. In the region, we face many of the same threats in terms of drug and weapons trafficking and terrorism threats from outside the region. During the recent visit to Washington of Defense Production Secretary Flavio Basilio, who we also hosted here at CSIS, it was clear that there is significant room for closer bilateral collaboration on defense and security issues. This is one of the questions that will be discussed this morning. I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Elcer Santana, who heads up our Brazil initiative here at CSIS, and Elcer will introduce the minister. Thank you.
Michael, it's a pleasure to have the minister here, and I'm starting in English and then I'll switch to Portuguese. So it's a pleasure to have the minister here, and we are relaunching the Brazil Initiative program.
Elcer, is your mic on?
There you go. So I was saying that we are relaunching, let's say, the Brazil Initiative program here at CSIS. We had the pleasure to have a few events, including the secretary about a month ago, and it's a pleasure to have the minister here this morning. I would like to recognize and thank the presence of the Ambassador Sérgio Amaral, who has been very strong support to this rebirth of the Brazil Initiative. And I would like also to recognize Secretary Basilio and our ambassador, who is always a pleasure to see. Welcome all. I would like to make a brief presentation of the minister. The minister is someone who has been in the Brazilian radar, public sector radar, for a very long time. And he has, in the past, had the courage to accept some very challenging tasks. The minister was secretário executivo do IBAMA, in a moment that where the issues relate to land and were not the easiest one. He was a minister of agricultural development in Brazil. He was the minister, extraordinary minister for the land policy in Brazil. So those are very challenging positions that the minister has performed exceptionally well. So, and he's bringing to the Minister of Defense this experience and his background in politics throughout since the redemocratization process. The minister was very active at that point and has ever been active on this point. So we have the honor to have someone who have a very broad and deep and structured view of issues, including defense. So I would like to pass the floor to you, Mr. Minister, please.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Can I speak from the podium?
Eu prefiro lá.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to be received here at CSIS one of the most prestigious think tanks that there are, not only in Washington, but in the United States. I would like to highlight the presence of in the delegation, the ambassador, Congressman Chavez and Senator Chavez and Congressman Roche, both representatives of the Brazilian Congress. It is a great pleasure for me to participate of this meeting organized by the Global Leaders Forums of CSIS to share the strategic vision of Brazil, to discuss global and regional issues, and present the current state of defense bilateral relationship with the United States. I would like to begin with an outlook of Brazil, its history, geography, and its identifying values, its vision of the world, strategy of defense and security, and its relationship in the world. They all come from the founding parameters of our country. A tropical nation, its miscegenation, great, a large expansion, loves peace and development, but it still has not reached its full potential. The history of Brazil begins with a geostrategic vision, ambitious at that, as an emergent power of transition between the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Portugal divided the world in two, with Spain democratically renegotiation in its favor, the meridian decided by the Pope. And I'm speaking about the Tordesillas Treaty that was signed on 7 June in 1494. With that, it was able to do the big navigations and farming in this land, enormous land. 2 centuries afterwards, the Tordesillas was overcome by the missionaries and the settlers that crossed that line and came into the Sertão and founded strongholds and farms. In there, they were white and Native Americans, blacks were all miscegenated. The expansion of the West was used, it followed the principle of uti possidetis of the Treaty of Madrid in 1750 that was signed on 13 January 1850. Ferdinand VI of Spain, and this gave Brazil the design that it has today. It got the independence from Portugal. The first thing they did was to conquer the land. The transition that transplanted to the Americas, the only monarchy that was sustainable in the continent, was a stability factor for the territory and for the nation, overcoming tendencies to fragmentation, as it happened like everybody knows, in Spanish Americas. Once the national unity was consolidated, the next challenge was to confirm the borders, what was inside Brazil and what was outside. The geographic outline of the country was consolidated with all its neighbors without wars and based on peaceful settlement of disputes, to respecting international law. And we're talking about 17,000 kilometers of border in a straight line. It's longer than from Washington to Sydney in Australia. It is acknowledged. It has a border with 10 countries. Of those 17,000, 9,000 are water borders. The rest are not land. So we're talking about jungles and water. The borders in Brazil are the starting point for our strategic point, made up of South America, Atlantic South, west of Africa, the Antarctic, Central America, and the Caribbean. This region of the world is made up of close to 30 countries, developing countries, that have emerging social problems similar to that of Brazil. That's why our strategic policy for defense in the country used as its strategic as a part of peace and development.
Far from being hegemonic, Brazil wants to promote peace, prosperity, and economic and commerce investment and cooperation for development and economic integration. South America is the only region in the world that has people and is denuclearized. Its defense architecture is made up of mechanisms, bilateral military cooperation network that includes the OAS, the Board, the Inter-American Defense Board, and the Defense Council that belongs to the UNASUR. This has created ties to create South American identity in defense. The regional military cooperation contribute to dissuasion that is also regional. In the Amazon, Brazil has been established bilateral mechanism, interministerial mechanism that involve law enforcement, intelligence, and military components. In addition, Southern countries have began a cooperation process last year for security in the borders and combating illicit transnational crime. Despite the advances in this area, with intelligence, security, and all that. And this has to do with the fact that crime is transnational now. So it's not possible to combat transnational crime domestically only. There is a need to move forward, and that's why it's important to have mechanism that can deal with this criminal networks that goes beyond borders. Considering how this has happened in our region, I am proposing with Brazilian Minister Aloysio Nunes having an initiative, South American initiative in the security and safety area to share information and intelligence and programs to monitor borders and the program called CIFROM that is under the Brazilian Army. This initiative can create towards recently in Vancouver, when I was 2 days ago, I had participated in a WIN conference. I had an opportunity to meet with my counterpart of defense from Argentina, from Colombia, and also from Mexico, Guatemala, and Uruguay. And that's why I discussed this initiative of South American initiative towards security, and was received very positively. And we have a meeting that is scheduled for next year in Argentina, and it's also open to the participation of other countries. We are very concerned with the crisis in Venezuela. At the same time, it is a political, socioeconomic, and humanitarian crisis. As a congressman, I visited many times and I talked to President Chavez and many opposition leaders that are part of the unity table. The Venezuelan issue is of interest to its own people, and in second place to South America. Its solution will only be viable through democracy, dialogue, and national reconciliation. Neighboring countries make available to the government and its Venezuelan brothers its efforts to contribute to recovery social paths. Any intervention would worsen the problem, closing the country even more. And it's a difficult dilemma, because if from one side we are against the dictatorship that exists in Venezuela today, foreign intervention would create a dramatic situation that we don't want to happen. Also, the support from partner countries from other parts of the world are very welcome. We have seen the successful peace agreement in Colombia, and it's a success for everybody that fights against war and for peace. Brazil is supporting the disarmament, demobilization, and integration in that country. In Southern Atlantic, 90% of our foreign trade goes to. Over this ocean, we have our exclusive economic zone. In 1986, Brazil led the resolution of the UN that is called as ZOPACA, that's free from political tension and armed conflicts. And I think it's in the interest of the United States that the South Atlantic is not a problem and is away from any source of concerns, political, military. We are concerned to build a base from NATO in the African, especially in Guinea and
against piracy and other transnational crimes must be faced through cooperation with other countries that must hold the leadership in those countries. Let me talk about some global topics. Brazil always left it very clear that one of its main sources of conflict in the world are development asymmetry among countries. With the benefit of a retrospective vision, we were able to see that the end of the Cold War did not bring the end of the story. With the triumph of globalized capitalism, the persistence of that asymmetry allied to anachronism of the structures of the world power, again, quickly challenged peace and security in the world through shocks of civilizations, fundamentalist terrorism, and armed patriotism. The tensions today remind us of the first decades after the Second World War. They remind us of that because they have the same origins and they propose absurdly the same solutions. Power politics, bipolarity, East-West bipolarity, and arms race. And the nuclear nightmare. Perception of threat in Europe bring NATO to increase defense spending and transforms from a regional defensive alliance to an entity that has to act in crisis in spaces that go beyond Europe-Atlantic jurisdiction, sometimes without mandate from the National Security Council. The Security Council. The world will never be safe with nuclear arms, especially in this worsening of terrorism. We will never be tired of remembering the large powers, the commitment they had to nuclear disarmament. The regime of non-proliferation that was installed 50 years ago with the TNP is not enough. It is asymmetric, and it is not enough if it doesn't go hand in hand with the obligation to disarm. It is also part of that treaty. Brazil is a signatory of the Tlatelolco Agreement and of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In September, it signed the treaty about prohibition of nuclear arms that allows for complete prescription of nuclear artifacts. As if that were enough, Brazil with Argentina gave an example of transparency, trust, and cooperation regarding non-proliferation. We're talking about ABAC. It is a four-part agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. In spite of all these demonstrations, the transfer of technology, the nuclear technology for peaceful means for Brazil and the rest and other world, it is very difficult and tried to be impeded by the main countries that signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Multilateralism is one of the pillars of foreign policy in Brazil, whether globally, whether through the UN or local, regional with Mercosul, UNASUL, and the OAS. Multilateralism regarding sovereignty, self-determination, international law, and human rights, and peaceful settlement of disputes, all principles of the UN Charter are things that were conquered by humanity, and they're part of the Constitution of Brazil. I just arrived from the Ministerial Conference of the UN in Vancouver about peace missions. In that forum, I presented the successful experience of a UN mission of 30 years in Haiti. We were also in the only division from Brazil. I remember we had 13,000 soldiers. I remembered the principles of Haiti that talks about the intervention or law enforcement and management of crisis cannot act without a mandate from the Security Council. I also mentioned that protection against armed conflict is one of the things in Brazil, and there are military officers don't have that mission, but they can have empathy for local population. And this has made it easier with our charter that has a component in Africa, another component in Europe, but we are on the extreme east. And we have an Indian population as well. So this melting pot in Brazil is the one we sent abroad for peace missions. And so it has made it very easy to communicate with the local populations. Our vision of the great conflicts in the world is conditioned by these principles. There is no possibility to find a solution to the current power asymmetry presentations, and social injustice and lack of governance. The conflicts in Africa and the Middle East have that as a basis. The scourge of terrorism and fundamentalism is also fueled by resentment and lack of opportunities and prosperity. So all the spheres of neocolonial influence, the complexity of wars, political shocks, genocides, refugee crisis, all of those are give way to deteriorating context and social economic. But that doesn't prevent us to be signers of all agreements. For Brazil just signed a law regarding combat terrorism. We repudiate terrorism. And in terms of cooperation, we will cooperate with all democratic countries who want to participate with us in denying and participating in combating terrorism. There's no tactical remedy that can solve the problem. When I'm talking about sustainable development for countries, even the most poor ones, the most complex crisis that cannot be explained by conditions of poverty. This is the case of the Korean Peninsula, where the multiplication of nuclear tests and missile tests is a drastic change of behavior, destabilizing the region, and it impacts the peace and world stability. Brazil condemns missile launches by the Popular Republic of Korea, and it will fully follow the pertinent resolutions of the Security Council and will contribute to create necessary conditions to go back to negotiations regarding peace and denuclearization of the province. And also it seems that has strengthened the political alliance against this. As a final point, I want to focus on a strategic relationship of Brazil with the United States. We share the same democratic values. Our economic, trade, and investment relations are traditional, are diversified, and continue to expand. Our alliance during World War II was a basis for military partnership of long-standing. Our academic exchange and cultural exchange does not stop enriching both of us. Our cooperation in defense is going back to its traditional benchmark, going back to broadening the agenda. The legal framework is solid. The agreement for cooperation in defense, agreement about classified military information from 2010, and the agreement for exchange of information, MIEA, all signed in March. They all give us the basis for this relaunching of this efforts. Now we need to finish the negotiations for technical agreements such as the acquisition of cross services and research and development, test and evaluation. In addition, it will be very important that the U.S. part make advancements with an analysis of the agreement for technological safeguards that we'll be signing in the Alcantara launch site. Now the synergy of the bilateral relation has to be better used for development of concrete projects that interest both countries and brings the industries closer. We have political and military talks, the consultation meeting between the staff joint staffs and the dialogue between the defense industry show convergence and the potential to be explored. There's new areas to be used, airspace, peace operation, participation of the United States in strategic projects of our armed forces in the naval sector, in border surveillance and cybersecurity, among others. We recently had, last week rather, we had Amazon log exercise that was done in the three border areas, Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and for the first time, the U.S. participated in that exercise, a military exercise with humanitarian goals. We want to broaden the exchange and the integration about our industrial bases of defense, establishing partnerships to develop defense products, which are interesting for both parts, and it will be two-way commerce. And so I have a proposal for you that Brazil and the United States can go beyond the issues discussion of problems or that tactical matters that tend to take up the entire time of the public opinion, press, and specialists, and that we go to explore the strategic potential of our bilateral relationship. In other words, that the largest democracies of the hemisphere can discuss and adopt a true agenda for the states in a long term, and not just government programs that are discontinued. We want an agenda for prosperity, peace, and development that is free from ideology and from unilateral attitudes based on power differential. A structuring agenda that is broad, that is based not on problems but in possibilities for development, based on shared values of democracy and mutual benefit, that will be a stabilization factor for economic development, not only in our countries, but with the power to irradiate to the other neighboring countries. The strengthening of our relationship and establishing a real strategic state policy will be a strengthening factor for peace, security, and development. Thank you very much.
We have about 20 minutes remaining for an informal conversation and some questions and answers from the audience. Elsie and I will start out with a couple of questions. At the very end of your remarks, you talked of the need to push our bilateral relationship into more of a strategic partnership. During the visit of Secretary Basilio a month ago, one of the American officials who was at the round table said something that still rings in my ears. He said, we clearly, between our two countries, have shared values, a very, very solid foundation of shared values. But he said those shared values need to be translated into shared interests, where we can work jointly towards common interests in the region and beyond the region. Could you comment on that statement, that shared values need to be translated into shared interests in order for us to reach a more strategic partnership?
Eu concordo com essa.
I agree with this statement that you mentioned, and I believe that there is a lot of opportunities to develop this partnership. And within defense, we are seeking to promote this, primarily through this agreements, effective agreements, and by calling everybody for dialogue and complementarity in our defense industrial base. And also, there is an expectation that this can spill out to other areas where this cooperation already exists. If you allow me to make a comment, we understand that the focus of the United States today has the main arena, everything that happens in Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and particularly what it has to do with Central Asia and South Pacific. And it's obvious because that are the places where the priority and most global issues and have nuclear issues are located. But recently, I have mentioned that before, President Trump, when he spoke to the UN General Assembly, he referred to 3 problem countries: Iran, Korea, and North Korea, and Venezuela. And talking overall we should say that I'm talking about South America and Brazil. We only get into the U.S. radar when there is a problem, when we believe that the focus should be more towards solutions, strategic solutions, as I mentioned before. Obviously, we are all concerned with these other regions, but mutually, we should also be concerned with how we complement each other, the opportunities that we have, and the solutions that we can mutually suggest and offer. In Brazil, we are available to cooperate fully and share a project for the region and in terms of Brazil. And this can be done. And we are available and willing to do that. There is willingness. But is the United States ready? Do they have a clear vision of what South America can be? Is there a well-defined policy towards South America and the role and possibilities that we have? And this is a complex issue. And I cannot say that we are clear about many of this, but Brazil is willing to build on it. And this, for us, is important and strategic and relevant. One quick question before we open it to the public in general. Brazil has one of its main features, intense use of social media. The level of how much it is used of computers and social media in particular is very surprising. And Brazil is a pioneer in the borderline. So this is a good thing, but it can also be a problem when we think of how weak and how sensitive Brazil is to cyber threats. There are many countries that are facing problems associated with new cyber actions. And here in the United States, there are a lot of discussions about the influence of foreign agents in American politics. In Brazil, since a lot of people use social media, could you say a little bit from the defense perspective this topic is dealt with, is being considered? I think it is, we should have a broader perspective on this. The base for the international system continues to be the national states. And here we have 2 problems. The first one is that we were not able to build global governance that is consistent with technological advances, the decrease in sovereignty of countries with the increases in transportation and economic transfer, and the legal and diplomatic aspects are having impacts on the sovereignty of countries. And the other related issue is that primarily in this area, in this cyber area, legislation, international legislation, international law is not following technological advances. Think about what apparently happened in the United States, what happened in France and in Catalonia. Servers located outside the country have interfered in the decision-making process of the countries. There is no legislation to deal with this problem, and this is supposed to get worse. And today, we have an era of unexpected things. And what does that mean? Our paradigms that allow us to understand future reality no longer serves its purpose. And if we continue with our paradigms and our models, we will make the situation worse in many areas. If we continue to have the same industrial model, we are going to have an environmental breakdown. So these are things that are related to it, and it shows a need to review and to revise and look for a different global governance. And with regard specifically to this case, we are concerned about it in Brazil. We are creating a working group in the electoral justice system with law enforcement and also the Cyber Defense Center of the Army. It's an attempt to move ahead with this, and there are many things involved. If we can say something about terrorism, for example, like the classic terrorism and like a postmodern terrorism, if you can say that, the classical terrorism would clearly identify the enemies. It was the presence, it would recruit. We have other terrorism today. What we can call postmodern terrorism is based on social media. It doesn't differentiate between enemies and friends. And there is no difference. Training doesn't happen. And recruitment happens through social media. So it creates a lot of problems for military defense and for law enforcement. And I think that this unexpected aspects is what it is. If the things that we use to resolve this issue and think about the future don't work anymore, so there is a need to, at some point, to stop and make changes to diplomatic and legislation, and this has to be done based on new governance. All signals point to these difficulties and these challenges that are growing. If we continue in many areas with the same modus operandi, and if we don't think about our frameworks, we are creating an abyss, and we have to review everything. This has to do with revising governance. No country, no matter how powerful, can face this situation alone. And so we need to revise governance and change the laws and everything. Thank you very much. I think we now...
For a couple of questions. So, if you can identify yourself, please.
Hi,
Make
thank
it
you.
short, please.
Hi, thank you. Paul Huang, reporter for the Epoch Times newspaper. I wonder what you think about China's large number of acquisitions of Brazil's infrastructures in recent years, which, according to one study, the 87 projects amount to $46 billion US. There's a tremendous amount, including large number of airports, ports, and even Brazil's electricity state grids. Now, what does Brazil think about China's acquisition of these critical infrastructures, and especially in the context of United States, what would they mean for the United States, since Brazil is the largest country in the South America, and so much is at stake there. And since China and the United States might engage in what you call the strategic competition there, would those control grant China an upper hand over the United States? Thank you.
Bom, os investimentos chineses.
Chinese investment in Brazil are done in accordance with Brazilian legislation, rules, and regulations. So any country that wants to invest in accordance with Brazilian rules and regulations is very welcome, regardless if it is the United States, China, or any other country. Has to do with the rules of trade and commerce. These acquisitions that you are talking about, if there is any concern with national security, that is now concerned about that. It doesn't affect anything in terms of our national security. With regard to the question, the last part of your question, I think that it's up to the United States to answer this question. But I would like to recall that in the book, Global Order, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger called attention to the future perspective between the United States and China, that there are two possibilities, cooperation or competition, and this is an open question. Today, if we were to simplify dividing countries as superpowers, those who can make its interests come true through military, technology, culture, anything else, and powers that are able to also have a global capacity that is not all-encompassing, and also regional powers that have more power than its neighbors. We can say today we have a superpower, if we can use this classification. It's the United States and three other countries that would be powers, global powers: China, Russia, and we can say maybe as an emerging power, but not fully. Maybe India specifically. I don't know if I forgot anybody, any country. And there are several regional powers. Maybe the future will lead to, we'll have two superpowers again, but we don't know. It's something that is open, and we'll see what the future shows. But regardless, the answer to your question, for the question that Henry Kissinger wrote, is that the future is a possibility for cooperation between these two countries, and that would be essential to global order. Thank you.
Sim, que eu esqueci ainda.
And I forgot, with regard to powers, the European Union would be a superpower, and three global powers. Primarily, European Union has a high statistics number. It has a lot of states and has a separate identity as a state, in the classical sense of the word. Senhor.
What is your energy outlook for Brazil? Are you guys getting much more involved with renewable energy? Because we're going to go into your military bases, and because you need help there. Renewable, wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, hydro.
Desculpe, eu não entendi. Vamos entrar em base militar? Isso é que eu Desculpe, não.
Can you repeat the question? I did not understand.
For your presidency, what is your thoughts and ideas about what you want to do with renewable energy, which is so important in renewable in all of South America, but particularly in Brazil? Wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, hydro.
O Brasil tem
Brazil, in spite of its size in the continent, one of the aspects that we are proud of in our development is our energy, our power. First, to join a country of that size within an electrical grid is not easy, and we were able to build that. Secondly, that power grid is a clean energy, basically, because a big part of it is hydroelectric power, that is riverly moved, if you will, hydroelectric power. So it's very green effect. So what we have had in Brazil, and that has happened very quickly, is wind energy in Brazil. It has increasingly taken up new shares of the market, and we are at the same time beginning, because we have market considerations, cost, investment, but we have a big potential in terms of solar power. And then biofuels. So Brazil has a potential as well for biofuels. And the guidance from the government, of the policy of this government, is to continue to explore hydroelectric power potential from the north of Brazil. We're finishing the construction of 2 large hydroelectric plants, and maybe in the future, when we're thinking of integrating basins, especially the Amazon and its affluents, with other rivers or other waterways, that possibility would be the next frontier to explore energy-producing sources of clean energy. As I mentioned before, solar energy has increased, I think, 25 or 30% over its base, which is still not that big, but in terms of real growth, and the same thing with biofuels. So again, I believe that is what is driving Brazil regarding power.
It's 12 o'clock, so it's time for us to wrap up, and the minister has another commitment. So I really appreciate your presence. I hope that we'll be able to bring you here again at some point in the future. I thank you all for coming. And Michael, if you want to formally close the... So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister.
Obrigado, senhor embaixador e senhor ministro.